All right, the drug class. Woo! We're going to start with section 2 of the steroid lecture, and away we go. So we're just going to get into some of the acute effects. I will need you to take a look at a couple of these. I can't make them all just audible, but the bottom line is here's a cartoon from Renee Levy, just big old muscular guy saying, "Steroids? Who, me? Never." And so the chance to, point out some of that irony about both needing to be absolutely huge with 2% body fat and unfortunately also somehow deny that you've used steroids puts a lot of these folks in a hell of a predicament. We will go ahead and get into some of the acute effects, but some of the most obvious ones are right here. You're going to have increased muscle mass and markedly lower body fat, but it's all through indirect or direct stimulation of testosterone system, and those are going to lead to some rough, both acute and chronic effects that we wouldn't normally see in just usual circumstances of, say, heavy-duty exercise. So here I've got a list of anabolic steroid effects in men, and stereotypically, with long-term use, you do get shrunken testicles. So the demo on this, usually in the steroid prevention programs, is to have a big balloon blown up, but you just hold it and then you let the air out of that balloon. And that's often gets a laugh and usually makes the point that, hey, this is something that's going to make your testicles essentially irrelevant. Your body is a system. If your testicles are perceiving that there's already enough testosterone in the system, obviously they're not going to enlarge to create more or anything like that, and so they do shrink. This is obviously not a single episode thing, but with long-term use this happens quite frequently. I'm sparing you a picture of it because it is weird looking, and it's unfortunately markedly more prevalent than you might guess. The unfortunate part is that somebody apparently was presenting this as a symptom of cannabis use. This really hurts our drug prevention efforts when people do that. So my very first High Times column, I actually had to answer a question about this. The corollary of this also is diminished sperm count, again, through comparable mechanisms. If you've got a ton of testosterone, you'd think sperm count would go way up, but the indirect effect is that basically your natural making of sperm is going to decrease. Usually when you're working out hard and exercising a lot, this is also a common effect. If you've overtrained, odds are high you're probably not trying to impregnate anybody during this time, so it doesn't seem like a serious issue, but later in life, you're going to want to make sure you can pass your genes on, or maybe not, but just to know. The rougher one here is the enlarged breast, and this is one of the vocabulary terms we got to learn, and that's gynecomastia. G-Y-N, that root, like a gynecologist, right, to make feminine, and the masses, in this case, in the breast. So literally, with repeated exposure to the steroids, you do see this growth in breast tissue, and unfortunately, it looks just like a little girl developing breasts, and so it's a rough one to deal with. They can be surgically altered. There's a draining of fluid there and things like that, but it's a pretty serious condition. I do have a photo of that coming up. Just prepare yourself. It is strange looking. And this is definitely a term I'm going to have on the test. Unfortunately, folks have attributed this to cannabis as well. There were some case studies written up in the 1970s. This is not a direct result of cannabis use. It is, however, a direct result of doing a bunch of bong hits and eating nothing but Cheetos and sitting on your ass playing video games. And so the distinction between just having increased body fat, which also doesn't seem to co-vary with cannabis use, but we don't want to blame poor health habits on cannabis use, even if they do co-vary. And then finally, the other big vocabulary term for this expression is priapism, and these are frequent, sustained, painful erections. Now, obviously, this sounds kind of hilarious. To have a boner all the time would be sort of comical and maybe even convenient, but it's the fact that it's not just inconvenient, it's genuinely painful. So the skin is stretched out. You can't actually have clothing or anything rubbing up against it, and it doesn't go away. So it literally makes it hard to get a full night of sleep. And it just is so peculiar, and it's, pretty obvious that things have gone awry in your physiological system. Obviously, if you even get a little bit of this, it's time to lay off on any kind of supplements. And at least this one is reversible. The gynecomastia requires surgery. Shrunken testicles, it's not like you're going to make them grow. You can get surgically added. Folks who are born with one testicle are going to get an artificial one. Yeah, this is not good. These aren't drugs that are really worth playing with. So here's the photo of the gynecomastia. This is a legit case. As you can see, this poor guy isn't even particularly muscular, and apparently got this from just a couple of cycles of steroid abuse. And yeah, I'm not even sure what to say, but you can see the increased breast tissue in the male. This is not something anybody who's caught up in their physical appearance would really want to deal with. Oh, in the show Fight Club, there's an allusion to this as well. All right, and now a couple of the anabolic steroid effects in women stereotypically, and these are marked better for reversible and irreversible, but we have lower voice, so the thickening of the vocal cords is common in males during development, and we do seem to have data suggest that that's perceived as attractive or at least healthy in heterosexual women who hear the voice of men. This is a tough one to reverse. There's extra tissue there now, basically. So when I lived in Hollywood and knew the women who were really into this, they could do a standard voice for, say, a job interview that'd be about this pitch. So you could tell it was a little bit either feigned or else just unnatural, but then you'd step on their toe and hear, hey. So there's just no way around this. It does kind of underscore our issues with what is stereotypically feminine and what is stereotypically masculine. But biologically, the means are certainly such that men's voices are lower than women's in the general population. Those, of course, do overlap, and we have stereotypes about that are definitely worth taking a good look at. All right, the enlarged clitoris. This is also irreversible. Truth be told, all of the labia, the tissue down there is just going to have both increased blood flow and eventually increased growth. Given how poor some partners are at identifying, maybe this isn't such a terrible thing, but truth be told, this just isn't natural, and it can be a little daunting to realize, hey, I've changed my body so dramatically that even my genitals are now irreversibly different. There are surgeries for this that have been proposed. The whole thought of it is kind of horrifying, and I imagine ridiculously painful. That's a highly innervated area with tons and tons of vascularization. That'd be a difficult issue. I did supervise one case, as I may have mentioned, Dr. Catherine Walker, who's now actually at the staff on Union. She's in their department. She had a case of a female bodybuilder, and essentially, poor woman ended up spending a great deal of money each month, almost $1,000 a month, on supplements and steroids. And the women's competition market is just not that lucrative. So she'd, spend $12,000 in a year to win a $500 competition and, a medal or something like that. It was just not a good thing. And then there is genuine withdrawal, as we'll get to, and it's present in both men and women. Increased appetite and decreased body fat. Well, these are obviously, in some ways, positive effects, depending upon what you're trying to do here. If you are trying to put on lean muscle mass, you do really have to feed that, although you can't go crazy, but certainly you're going to eat 3,000 calories a day instead of the usual 2,000 and work out really, really hard. Decreased body fat has a bunch of correlates in women, though, that you don't often see in men. That includes diminished menstruation. Oh, the increased appetite is a two-edged sword, though. So you want to eat, lean protein sources, complex carbohydrates. You really are at risk for eating anything in sight. So it's unfortunate, but you have to really control the availability of certain foods. And once you get started, you have to, weigh things out and make sure you stop. And it's rough to be hungry all the time, as you can imagine. A woman who lived near me in West Hollywood would say, like, tears would just be streaming down her face. The resisting those urges and the general emotionality and response acutely is also really rough. So you've got diminished menstruation. Essentially, menses are going to stop when testosterone is at a particular level. The you probably learned about luteinizing hormone and that whole subset of very intriguing cyclical releases of hormones that lead to menstruation. That's completely interrupted, so of course you don't menstruate. And that's often a correlate of that decreased body fat. Increased sex drive, again, it's easy to joke and say, oh, what's wrong with that? But truth be told, this is present in men as well. I don't know why they put that on this slide, actually, but I guess with men, increased sex drive is so normative, nobody makes a big deal out of it. But we're talking about like literally wanting to have at least 4 orgasms a day. This turns into a lot of stress in any relationship. Either you're going to have multiple partners, take care of things yourself a lot, or one really understanding one. And I'm loath to emphasize it, but truth be told, this takes time. So if you're spending literally 2 hours a day having sex, then how do you do the other things you need to get done each day? You really have to make that a priority and work on time management. And then decrease breast size. So in part because the soft tissue of the breast is made from fat cells, that's going to decrease. So you do see, well, they're at risk for breast implant. I don't want to use the term at risk, but basically the correlates are to have breast implants as well. That leads to a whole other set of issues. They've changed the rules in the competitions for women now, so they have a more fitness approach rather than just a pure muscle mass. So this is my old girlfriend. No, this is a female bodybuilder from the late 1980s, actually. And as you can see, if I would cover up the stereotypically feminine haircut here and the pink thong bikini. Otherwise, it's really hard to determine gender from just say, a physical part. So if you just saw that leg, for example, or you just saw that arm or the back, it would be hard to guess, oh yeah, that's obviously a woman. It says something about, you know, how fluid our perceptions are on this, but also you can imagine the extensive use of some kind of testosterone-enhancing drugs she would have had to use, and then the remarkable amount of working out that would be required to reach this physical level. So this competition is no longer around. The Ms. Olympia competition is no longer conducted. They have a more fitness approach. It's not that steroid use is necessarily decreased, but it doesn't have the same goals. I don't know. I find this really remarkable. I know plenty of men who find this attractive who don't necessarily self-identify as wanting to have a male partner or a masculine partner. Hey, it takes all kinds. All right. Well, I do have a just sample item here. So which one of these is painful erections? Is it priapism, gynecomastia, or dolorosa? And obviously it's priapism. We just discussed it. Dolorosa is the kind of name I would make up for something like this, and I will definitely have a priapism question on there. So just make sure you don't get hoodwinked by some kind of distractor that sounds halfway scientific or relevant. And definitely know the distinction between that and gynecomastia, the breast growth. And then which of these symptoms is reversible? I've got the balding, the aggressiveness, and the lower voice. Obviously, the aggressiveness is the one, it's more of a state. But when you're doing these regularly, of course, the aggressiveness tends to become trait-like. You're much more aggressive throughout, say, the workout season or when you're on them for, literally months on end. So I've got a cartoon here from Mike Keefe's work at the Denver Post, and it's just two, beefed up guys playing chess. And one is screaming check as he slams a piece down on the board really hard. And it says, when steroids creep into the competition. This does raise another set of issues about performance-enhancing drugs in other domains, particularly cognitive tasks. So I know we were talking about the World Series of Poker before when we were doing some of the work on the stimulant drugs. Apparently, a bunch of those folks were on Adderall. They had a long duration cognitive tasks in these poker events, and a lot of folks apparently are abusing prescription stimulants on that. And then, given the health effects of those and trying to have an even playing field, is it fair for them to do that? And then, if we're going to argue, yes, it's okay, they should get to do whatever they want with their bodies, why aren't these athletes then allowed to do whatever they want to their bodies? And we're stuck with the same dilemma essentially. How do we make it so that everybody has a chance to succeed without necessarily having to put their health at risk, and the civil liberties are still there? And obviously we could have a nice discussion of these ethics if we actually were having a discussion. All right, and then this was just a curious image I found of a man looking at an ape who looks remarkably like him, who happens to be in a cage while he gets to run around free. I can perseverate on some of the issues about the way we treat animals, but I don't need to get into that. But evolutionarily, again, we get another reminder that we're responding to testosterone as the entire phylogenetic spectrum does. So testosterone is going to work on multiple animals, and we do see these drugs applied to other animals, not just humans. And, obviously they don't provide informed consent on that. All right, so this will be the last slide for this section, but the bottom line is there's some patterns of anabolic steroid abuse that are designed either to maintain sensitivity of the receptors or to avoid detection if you're going to have to take a test before competition to essentially assert that you haven't been using them when in fact you have. And so the whole requiring people to lie in this is, I think, kind of farcical, but these expressions actually do still show up in some of this literature. So shotgunning, taking multiple oral and injectable steroids. I mean, it's just sort of like, hey, we're going to shoot in every direction in every way we can. This, unfortunately, isn't studied particularly well, in part because no one would do a randomized clinical trial of this, and folks are reluctant to report having done it. So we don't know, but obviously it would make sense that this is going to put both liver and kidney at exaggerated risk for problems than a single approach. All the claims that this is also going to create increases in muscle mass that are more dramatic or more rapid, again, we just don't have the data, and the confound, of course, with the placebo effect is a pretty intense one. Cycling, so having essentially 1 month to 18 weeks of steroid use and then to take an off period, was purportedly designed to maintain the sensitivity of those receptors so you don't increase your need for the presence of that. The tolerance to this, at least the pharmacodynamic tolerance, is very real. You do see the receptors losing some of their sensitivity, and actually the number of receptors seems to decrease, at least in some of the rodent work. And so to have a small period on, take a few weeks off, a small period on, take a few weeks off, seem to be adaptive, and pharmacologically it makes sense that that should help you maintain some of the sensitivity. I gotta admit, though, that the withdrawal is often the worst case, when the worst part of the emotionality. Those reactions are genuine. Those put folks at risk. So I may have mentioned I had a client who was a nose guard at a football team at a place where I was working, and he beat up the ATM machine. If I've told the story already, I apologize. It was a long time ago. The ATM machine only had $10 bills, and he punched it multiple times, hurt, of course, his hand, then couldn't play. The negative consequences of just literally a minute of impulsivity are pretty rough. And he was actually, we were just getting into the withdrawal, and yeah, I messed up. Pyramiding, essentially you're going to increase use prior to competition. So gradually start with one dosage, increase that a little, increase that a little, increase that a little, increase that a little, and then taper off in that same direction in hope of making the withdrawal symptoms markedly less dramatic. So decrease by a little, decrease by a little, decrease by a little, decrease by a little. Anytime you give your body more time to adapt to anything, it often has a better chance, as long as that's not already toxic. I mean, we do a lot of tiptoeing around ways to use this medically. Odds are high this would be a great idea if these were prescribed under certain situations. There are folks who have disorders where, HIV positive folks who are losing lean body weight. A combination of Megace and cannabis would at least be a great idea. But again, you don't want to overdo it. Folks who drop to 1/3 of their original body weight are rarely coming back. Like that, particularly lethal. And so, I mean, there's a situation where we really do need this. And the hope is we'll get somebody back to within 80% of their normal body weight, decrease this, and away we go. It's not what's usually meant by pyramiding. Usually, if bodybuilders are talking about this, they mean to be finished in time to be able to pass a drug test. When we talk about how the drug tests work, though, you're going to see this could be literally months before the competition. So it does make for a complicated bunch of guessing, really.